asked my followers, what's the most confusing about diet? And one question that came up was, why are oats allowed on modified SCD, but not on SCD diet? It's a great question. SCD diet. It's a great question because the answer isn't just that mSCD, as modified SCD is known as. It's not just that it's not as strict. There's actually a specific reason why oats keep showing up as one of the first grains that people add back to their diet if they've been following specific carbohydrate diet. But before I get into oats, let me back up and explain what mSCD or modified SCD even means, because it's important to know the context of what we're talking about here. Welcome back to Digestible Dialogues. It's been a while since I had a podcast episode, but I am relaunching again with this great question I got from one of my followers, and that is about mSCD and SCD. So SCD, of course, stands for specific carbohydrate diet, which I have talked about a lot on this channel. But in a nutshell, specific carbohydrate diet is hard to say. And it is a grain-free, gluten-free diet that eliminates starches and grains and sugars and refined foods and a lot of things like that. So what is mSCD? mSCD means a couple of different things. There are a few diet nutritional therapies that actually use the term mSCD, so they develop their therapy based on specific carbohydrate diet with some modifications, hence the M. So one of these is Stanford Children's Hospital uses something they call mSCD. And then there is IBD-AID, which is out of UMass, and I don't know that they actually use that term, but the principles are the same in that both of those diets do include oats. The other context of mSCD is just people like me who followed a specific carbohydrate diet and then decided to add foods that are not part of the diet, but still consider SCD to be, because the basis of the way I eat is still very much rooted in SCD diet, the principles of it. And I think that's why people like to use the modified, because they're also rooted in the principles of it. And there's actual nutritional therapies that used SCD as their basis and then incorporated some more recent research, patient trials, studies, patient needs. They include oats as one of the most included items, although there are other common foods for mSCD like rice, chocolate, or cocoa powder, unsweetened cocoa, not just chocolate. And sweet potatoes, probably the next most common, probably might be even more common than oats. Sweet potatoes is probably the most common beyond SCD food that I see people eat. And then rice usually, although rice is not something I actually have ever added back in but I have added in quinoa, so I'm fine with that. But I think that it's about individual needs and choices, and for some people, following a strict SCD diet is not feasible for a variety of reasons, and that is not for any of us to judge about. It's for what's doing best for them. I've talked about that a lot as well, but I always like to stress it because I don't like the idea that people get, very don't talk about anything else. SCD is the only way, because it is not the only way, and I've explored that in many videos, and I will be exploring that in something coming up soon. So stay tuned for that. But I just want to say there are nutritional therapies that actually do use this term or something close to it, like IBD-AID, where they have some phases of dietary nutritional therapy. And one thing that is stressed that I have found out just as adding new foods, when you add these new foods in, it kind of frees up your thoughts about food, which is great, because if something isn't allowed, then we feel like we're cheating. Whereas when we're making choices, it doesn't feel so much as cheating. So I think that is a part of the therapy. But getting to oats. So oats were excluded from specific carbohydrate diet, not because of them being oats. They're excluded because they are part of a group of, they're a cereal grain, and all cereal grains are not allowed on specific carbohydrate diet, regardless of whether they contain gluten or not. So that's important to know. It's not just gluten grains like wheat that are not, it's all grains, because a specific carbohydrate diet is focused on monosaccharides. and oats are a polysaccharide. So the important thing about that is that it's not singling out oats as bad. It's part of a category that is excluded from the diet. So why is oats a common one added back in? Oats are actually one of the first foods that the FDA has recognized as being healthful in terms of lowering cholesterol and being beneficial in reducing the risk of heart disease. So oats are a soluble fiber, and that makes them slower to digest. Now, this is kind of interesting because I see a lot of people who are on SCD diet, because when you talk about something slower to digest or resistant starch, which cooled oats, when you cook them and cool them, they become a good source of a resistant starch. I think a lot of people interpret the word resistant as it being bad, but actually resistant starches are very good. They feed the good bacteria in our gut, and that helps repair or keep our gut lining healthy. So when we are not experiencing severe symptoms, soluble fiber and resistant starches are very healthy for us. When we have active inflammation, they can be very difficult to digest and might be aggravating. So that is why they're excluded when you have active disease. You got to be very careful about them. But when your gut is healing, they're actually something that can be very beneficial towards maintaining a healthy gut. So that's just something to keep in mind. One of the reasons why I added it back is, as I'm getting older, I'm thinking more about my cholesterol, my heart health. And if you are a fan of Danielle Walker, who is the author of the Against All Grain books and Against All Grain, but she actually recently added oats back into her diet as well, out of the concerns of heart disease and stuff as she's getting older. So I think that, these are all individual choices, but the main reason why, so I don't really like to think of it as allowed or not allowed as far as the modified SCD. So SCD diet, specific carbohydrate diet, has a very specific list of foods that are allowed, not allowed, and they have their parameters about the monosaccharides and versus polysaccharides, and that is why Elaine Gottschall, who wrote Breaking the Vicious Cycle, was under the belief that grains were bad for our system in general. Maybe not everybody, but people who have Crohn's and IBD, whereas more modern studies don't really corroborate that should be a forever thing. I don't know that Elaine actually thought it should be forever, but there are a lot of people in the SCD community who interpret it that way. I actually don't. I would love to have been able to talk to her more about that, especially, unfortunately, she passed away many years ago, so she didn't get to see some of the more modern research. I would love to know what she thought about it, but we can't know that. So we are on our own, as I have said many times, about what do we do when we achieve healing. And some people don't really achieve the same amount of healing. So somebody like me is in complete remission with no inflammation. I am looking at long-term gut health. What is good for a healthy gut in an average person? And am I the average person? Not totally, but I've pretty much gotten there. So that's how we have to, everybody's got to think of themselves in their own way in that respect. So oats are a good source of soluble fiber. They're a good source of resistant starch, but they're just kind of good at just kind of helping you maintain a balance there. And they're good for satiation. And like I said, they are a good prebiotic, which is one of the reasons why IBD-AID from UMass includes them. Prebiotics help feed the healthy bacteria in our gut and help maintain the right balance so that our more friendly bacteria thrive and keep our gut healthy. Keep a nice, diverse, healthy microbiome. So oats are a good source of prebiotic. So let's talk a minute here about different kinds of oats. So there are steel-cut oats, there are rolled oats, then there are quick instant oats. Steel-cut oats and rolled oats. And so I started out with steel-cut oats, and now I just recently tried sprouted rolled oats. They're basically the same. They have the same fibers, but the steel-cut are less broken down, so they actually have a slower absorption and even slower. So steel-cut oats are less broken down. They are lower on the glycemic index, but they could be a little bit harder to digest because they are less broken down. So depending on where your gut health is, a rolled oat might be a better choice. It reduces phytic acid and activates your enzymes, so it could be a little quicker, so it might be easier for you to digest. But on the IBD-AID, they actually have steel-cut oats as the introduction because of that prebiotic, because it is slower to digest in your lower intestine, which helps feed that that bacteria. But I do want to stress, when you have active disease, there is a reason why people with very active disease report that they actually eat all the refined processed foods, that they sometimes can digest it easier depending on what it is, but like white bread and things like that, because your body doesn't have to do too much work to digest those things. So that is why people with active disease sometimes are like, I don't know why, I try to eat healthy, but the more processed foods are actually easier for me to digest because they're already processed. They might be kind of super processed. So I do want to use caution. I want everybody to use caution. And as always, this is not medical advice of any kind. It's just informational. But I do want to say that, these foods are very healthy, but they can be more difficult to digest. So you need to think about where you're at in your symptoms and your progression of disease. And we're all different there, and we all have different reactions to different types of foods. So that's always something to keep in mind. I don't want people to feel like they're doing something wrong, that if they can't handle that kind of food, whatever choices you make are the best ones for you. And sometimes it takes a little bit to arrive at that. But I hope this helps. And if you have questions about like these types of foods or, any foods that I eat that are, beyond SCD, please leave a comment and I will be happy to answer. Thank you so much for watching or listening to Digestible Dialogues. And if you have something you'd like me to discuss, please send me a message or leave a comment.